Introduction. The readiness that never comes. There is a version of your life you have been preparing for. You have been gathering what you will need, building the right foundation, waiting for the conditions to align in a way that makes starting feel reasonable rather than reckless. You are not avoiding the thing. You are preparing for it. There is a difference, or so the story goes. The story is convincing because it is partly true. Preparation matters. Timing is real. Some things genuinely should not be rushed. The story uses these truths as cover for something that has nothing to do with preparation and everything to do with the feeling of not being ready. A feeling that, it turns out, does not respond to preparation the way we expect. The feeling of readiness is not a byproduct of sufficient preparation. It is not something that arrives when you have done enough groundwork. For most things that matter, the feeling of readiness only arrives, if it arrives at all, after you have already started. After you are already in it. After the thing you were waiting to feel ready for has already begun. This book is about the gap between where you are and where you want to be, specifically the portion of that gap that exists not because you lack capability or resources, but because you are waiting to feel something you will not feel until you have already crossed it. The goal is not to convince you to be reckless. It is to help you distinguish between genuine preparation and the waiting that wears preparation's clothes. One moves you forward. The other keeps you standing at the edge, rehearsing the jump, until the edge itself becomes the destination. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Right Moment. The right moment is one of the most powerful and most persistent fictions in human experience. It suggests that somewhere in the future, a set of circumstances will arrange themselves in a configuration so suitable that starting will feel natural, obvious, and low risk. All that is required is to wait for it. The right moment almost never comes, not because circumstances never improve, but because the standard for what constitutes the right moment rises in proportion to our desire to avoid starting. When the finances improve, there will be the question of whether they are stable enough. When the stability arrives, there will be the children, or the job, or the relationship. There is always another reason the moment is not quite right. This is not cynicism. It is an observation about how the waiting mechanism works. The mechanism is not calibrated to assess circumstances objectively. It is calibrated to protect you from the discomfort and risk of starting. Since that discomfort does not change when circumstances improve, the mechanism finds new reasons to wait. The right moment, where it exists at all, is created, not waited for. It is created by deciding that now is close enough to right, and by making the conditions slightly more favorable through action rather than through anticipation. The person who builds the right moment is always further ahead than the person who waits for it. This does not mean all timing is irrelevant. Some timing genuinely matters. The question worth asking is not, is the moment right? But, what, specifically, would I need in order to start, and is my current assessment of those requirements honest? In most cases, an honest accounting reveals that the requirements are lighter than the feeling of unreadiness suggests. Chapter 2. What waiting actually costs. Waiting feels low cost because it is passive. You are not doing anything wrong. You are simply not yet doing the thing. The cost is invisible precisely because it is the cost of something that has not happened, of a life not yet being lived, of a version of yourself not yet being built. But the costs are real and they accumulate. There is the straightforward cost of time, of the learning, the progress, the relationships and opportunities that would have emerged from the thing you are not doing. Time spent waiting is time that cannot be recovered, and every period of waiting is a permanent reduction in the time available to pursue whatever it is you are waiting to pursue. There is also the cost of energy. Not starting something you have decided you want to do requires a continuous, low-grade expenditure of energy to maintain the decision not to start. The thought comes up. You process it, reassure yourself, file it away. The thought comes up again. Over months and years, this cycle is genuinely exhausting, more exhausting, usually, than actually doing the thing would be. And there is the cost to your self-concept. Every period of waiting reinforces a particular story about who you are. Someone for whom this thing is always on the horizon but never in the present. That story solidifies over time. The longer you wait, the more convincing it becomes that you are simply the kind of person who does not do this. What started as a delay hardens into an identity. The total cost of waiting is almost always higher than the cost of starting imperfectly. Not in the short term. In the short term, waiting is comfortable and starting is uncomfortable. But the calculation reverses over any significant time horizon, and most things worth doing operate on significant time horizons. Chapter 3. Preparation versus Procrastination. The distinction between preparation and procrastination is one of the genuinely difficult judgments in any endeavor. They look identical from the outside, and they can feel identical from the inside, because procrastination is exceptionally good at disguising itself as preparation. Genuine preparation has specific characteristics. It is targeted. It addresses a real, identifiable gap between your current capability and what the task requires. It is finite. There is a point at which enough has been done and starting is the right move. And it is active. It produces something. Knowledge, skill, resources, infrastructure. Procrastination dressed as preparation has different characteristics. The gap it addresses is vague and ever-expanding. There is no defined endpoint. The preparation could always be more thorough. And its primary output is the feeling of doing something without the exposure of actually doing the thing. The clearest diagnostic is the question: what would it take for me to feel ready enough to start? If you can answer that question specifically and the answer is achievable, you are probably preparing. If the answer shifts every time you approach it, or if the requirements expand as you meet them, you are probably procrastinating. The other diagnostic is whether the preparation is producing diminishing returns. At some point, additional preparation adds less than starting would. The learning that comes from doing, from encountering the real thing in its full complexity, almost always exceeds the learning available from preparing to encounter it. When you have reached that crossover point, further preparation is a cost, not an investment. Chapter 4. What not ready actually means. When people say they do not feel ready, they are reporting a real experience. The feeling is genuine. The question is what the feeling is actually telling them, and whether what it is telling them should be acted on. The feeling of not being ready is, in most cases, the feeling of not being certain. You cannot fully predict how it will go. You cannot guarantee success. You cannot know in advance that you will handle every situation competently. This uncertainty is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is interpreted as a signal that starting is premature. But uncertainty is not incompetence. Uncertainty is the normal condition of anyone doing something they have not done before. The person who knows exactly how everything will unfold is not doing something new. They are doing something they have already done. The feeling of not being ready is therefore not evidence that you are not ready. It is evidence that what you are about to do is new. This is not a trivial refrain. It changes what the feeling is asking of you. If the feeling is signaling genuine incompetence, the response is preparation. If the feeling is signaling novelty and uncertainty, the response is action, because the uncertainty will not be resolved through further preparation. It will only be resolved through the experience of having done the thing. Not ready, in most cases, simply means, I have not done this before, and I do not know how it will go. That is not a barrier to starting. That is the starting point for every worthwhile thing anyone has ever done. Chapter 5. How action creates clarity. One of the most persistent misconceptions about major undertakings is that clarity comes first and action follows. That you should know what you want before you pursue it. That you should understand the landscape before you enter it. That starting without a clear picture of the destination is irresponsible. For complex, real-world endeavors, this is largely backwards. Clarity comes from action, from the contact with reality that only happens when you are actually doing the thing. Before you start, you have a model of what the thing will be like. After you start, you have information. The information is always richer, more accurate, and more useful than the model. This is why so many people who have been planning something for years find, once they start, that the reality is different from what they expected. Sometimes harder, sometimes easier, almost always different. And the adjustments required to navigate the real thing cannot be made in advance, because they depend on information that only the experience of doing provides. The clarity you are waiting for will not arrive through more thought, more research, or more preparation. It will arrive through the encounter with the actual problem. The writer who is waiting to know what their book is about before they start writing will wait indefinitely. The writer who starts and discovers what the book is about in the process of writing it will eventually have a book. Acting before you feel clear is not recklessness. It is the acknowledgement that in most meaningful endeavors, clarity is a destination, not a starting condition. You arrive at it by going, not by standing still and thinking harder about the journey. Chapter 6. The Minimum Viable Start. One reason starting is so difficult is that we imagine it in its full form. The project, fully realized. The commitment, fully honored. The life, fully transformed. Starting feels like agreeing to all of that at once, and agreeing to all of that at once is genuinely overwhelming. The minimum viable start is the smallest action that constitutes having actually begun. Not planned to begin. Not prepared to begin. Actually begun. It does not need to be impressive. It does not need to be representative of the scale of the eventual undertaking. It just needs to be real, a genuine first step taken in the actual world rather than rehearsed in the mind. The minimum viable start works because it breaks the psychological hold of the starting problem. Once you have started, you are no longer someone who is about to start. You are someone who has started. That shift in identity, small as it sounds, changes the entire landscape. The thing that was ahead of you is now behind you, and the thing that comes next feels different, more continuous than inaugural, more step than leap. What qualifies as a minimum viable start depends on the thing. For some endeavors, it is a single email sent. For others, it is 30 minutes of actual work. For others, it is a public commitment that creates accountability. The common element is that it is real, it happened, and it cannot be unfiled as a plan. The size of the start does not determine the size of the destination. Every large thing began as something small, often embarrassingly small, often nothing like what it eventually became. What mattered was that it began. Because without the beginning, none of the rest was possible. Chapter 7. Fear of Irreversibility. One of the specific fears embedded in the not ready feeling is the fear of irreversibility. Once you start, you cannot unstart. Once people know you are doing this, you cannot quietly undecide without them knowing. Once you have committed resources, you cannot fully recover them. Starting involves closing doors, and closed doors feel dangerous. This fear is largely exaggerated, for a simple reason. Most starts are far more reversible than they appear from the outside. Very few decisions are actually permanent. You can stop. You can change direction. You can try something for a year and decide it is not right. What you cannot do is recover the time spent waiting. That is the genuinely irreversible cost. The cognitive error here is treating starting as more final than it is while simultaneously treating waiting as more neutral than it is. Starting is experienced as a commitment. Waiting is experienced as a suspension of commitment. But waiting is also a commitment, to the current state, to the current life, to the current version of yourself. The choice is not between commitment and openness. It is between different kinds of commitment. For the genuinely irreversible decisions, the ones that truly close doors permanently, careful deliberation is warranted. But those decisions are far rarer than the fear of irreversibility suggests. For the vast majority of things people are waiting to start, the fear of closing doors is protecting them not from a real danger but from the discomfort of movement. The question worth sitting with is, if I started and it did not work out, what would actually happen? Answering it honestly, specifically, not catastrophically, almost always reveals that the failure case is recoverable. And knowing that, in concrete terms, reduces the fear considerably. Chapter 8. Permission you don't need. Many people are waiting for permission without quite realizing that is what they are waiting for. Permission from someone with authority, a mentor, a credential-granting institution. Permission from the market, evidence that other people have succeeded at this. Permission from their circumstances, a sign that the conditions are aligned enough to justify beginning. Permission waiting is seductive because it distributes responsibility. If you start only when someone else has sanctioned the start, then some of the risk of it not working belongs to them. If you wait for proof that others have succeeded, then your starting has precedent. It is not as exposed as going first. But permission is rarely given in advance for the things that most need to be done. The things that require the greatest personal courage are precisely those that have no established route, no formal sanction, no proven path. If you wait for permission to do something genuinely new, you will wait indefinitely, not because permission is being withheld, but because there is no authority positioned to give it. The permission you are waiting for, in most cases, is simply the decision to grant it to yourself. That decision feels exposing because it means owning the choice entirely, the risk, the responsibility, the outcome. But that exposure is also what makes it meaningful. The things we do by our own authority, without waiting for someone else to approve them, are the ones that most fully express who we actually are. Chapter 9. The identity shift that starting requires. Beneath the practical reasons for waiting, the timing, the resources, the preparation, there is often an identity reason that goes unexamined. Starting the thing would require you to be a different kind of person than you currently are. Or at least, it would require you to let go of a story that currently serves you. If you have been someone who intends to do this thing, starting it means you can no longer be that person. The aspiration becomes an attempt. The potential becomes performance, visible, accessible, subject to verdict. As long as you have not started, the ideal version of how it could go remains intact. Starting risks that ideal. There is also the identity you build through waiting. The person who is preparing, gathering, planning. This is a stable identity with its own dignity. Starting disrupts it. You become someone who is doing rather than someone who is getting ready to do, and that shift can feel like a demotion rather than a promotion, depending on how strongly the preparing identity has been established. The identity shift that starting requires is real. It is not imagined or trivial. But it is a shift toward something rather than away from it, toward the person who does the thing rather than the person who is perpetually about to. Both are real identities. Only one of them leads anywhere new. Chapter 10. Starting imperfectly on purpose. Perfectionism and waiting are closely allied. The perfectionist waits not for readiness in general but for readiness to do it right, to do it well enough that the first attempt represents a genuine reflection of their capability rather than an embarrassing prototype. The problem is that first attempts are always prototypes. This is not a flaw in the first attempt, it is the nature of first attempts. The capability required to do something well develops through the process of doing it. You cannot do it well before you have done it at all, because doing it is how you acquire the judgment and skill that doing it well requires. Starting imperfectly on purpose is therefore not a compromise, it is an acknowledgement of how skill development actually works. The imperfect first attempt is not a failure to achieve the standard. It is the first step in building toward the standard. There is no other first step available. The people whose work you most admire did not begin with the work you admire. They began with worse versions of it, often dramatically worse. The gap between those early versions and the work that eventually earned admiration was closed by doing the work repeatedly, with attention, over time. The early badness was not an obstacle to the later quality, it was the path to it. Starting imperfectly, on purpose, means deciding that the first version does not need to be the best version. It needs to be real. It needs to exist. Because only from the existence of the imperfect first version can anything better be built. Conclusion. The cost of the unlived version. Somewhere in you there is a version of your life that has not yet been lived. A version in which you started the thing you have been waiting to start. It is not an ideal version. It is imperfect and difficult and not quite what you imagined. But it is real, and it is yours, and it is the product of having chosen movement over the comfortable stasis of perpetual preparation. The unlived version costs something. It costs the time already spent. It costs the things that would have grown from the start you did not make. It costs a particular kind of self-knowledge that only comes from having tried. None of this is irreversible yet. The start is still available. It is available in a smaller form than it was before. The time already spent cannot be recovered, but it remains available, and the version of your life that begins from it is still worth living. You will not feel ready. The feeling will not arrive before you begin. But it may arrive somewhere in the doing, the quiet, grounded sense of someone who is finally where they decided to be rather than where circumstances conspired to keep them. That is readiness earned rather than waited for. It is the only kind that lasts. Key takeaways. The feeling of readiness does not precede starting, it follows from it. Waiting for it to arrive before beginning is waiting for something that only the beginning can produce. The right moment is created through action, not discovered through waiting. The threshold for what constitutes the right moment rises in proportion to the desire to avoid starting. Waiting has real costs. The time lost, the energy spent maintaining the decision not to start, and the identity that solidifies around not having done it. Genuine preparation is targeted, finite, and produces something. Procrastination is vague, endless, and produces primarily the feeling of doing something. Not ready means, I have not done this before, and I do not know how it will go. That is not a barrier. That is the starting condition of every worthwhile thing. Clarity comes from action, not the other way around. The information available from doing always exceeds the information available from planning to do. The minimum viable start is the smallest action that constitutes having actually begun. It does not need to be impressive. It needs to be real. Most starts are far more reversible than they appear. The genuinely irreversible cost is the time spent waiting, not the imperfect attempt. The permission you are waiting for must be granted to yourself. No external authority is positioned to give it to you for something genuinely yours. A note at the end. At some point while listening to this, a specific thing probably came to mind. The thing you have been waiting to start. The one with the reasons attached to it, the ones that are real and also the ones that are convenient. This book cannot tell you whether your reasons are real or convenient. That is a judgment that requires honesty about your own interior, a kind of honesty that is harder than it sounds and more revealing than it is comfortable to be. What it can tell you is this: the gap between where you were and where you want to be will not close on its own. It closes through the small, accumulating actions of someone who decided that now was close enough to write, and started anyway. That is all starting is. Not a grand gesture. Not a declaration. Just the quiet, ordinary, undramatic act of doing the first small part of the thing, and then the next part, and then the next. Until one day the gap has closed from behind you without your noticing exactly when.